Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're cracking open a real cornerstone of bow hunting research, part 6 of Dr. Ed Ashby's 2007 study update. If you're serious about arrow performance, broadhead performance, well, Ashby's work is fundamental.
Absolutely. Foundational is the right word. And we're not just, glancing at it. We're really taking a deep dive here into
Awesome.
what Ashby was finding out about two, absolutely critical things for broadhead lethality.
Which are?
How broadheads perform when they smack into bones specifically, why they might skip off, and also what actually makes them cut tissue efficiently.
Right. And this isn't just like super technical stuff for the gearheads only. This research, it has real world meaning for every single shot you take with a bow, whether you're new to it or been doing it for years.
Yeah, it's all about understanding why your gear behaves the way it does right at that moment of impact.
Exactly. Our mission today, to pull out the really key insights from this part of the study so you can be, well, better informed out there in the field. Okay, let's unpack this.
That's good.
So the study kind of kicks off with a very specific and honestly pretty surprising observation they made while testing one particular broadhead, the 190 grain a bow year.
Yeah, they were running tests with this specific setup. A left single bevel, 190 grain Bowyer.
Yeah.
It was mounted on left fletch shafts that were internally footed IF shafts, they called them.
And these were heavy arrows.
Oh, yeah. Heavy extreme FOC shafts. So the balance point was way forward. Total arrow mass was 810 grains. Heavy setup. And the test subject was a big buffalo bull shot at 20 yards.
Okay, so heavy arrow, tough animal. What happened on the first shot?
Well, the first shot hit a broadside rib, and it performed, pretty much like you might expect with a setup like that. Got 16 inches of penetration, double lung hit. Classic result, really.
Even though that oboe is a pretty wide head, right? Lower mechanical advantage.
It is. It's wider than some of the longer, narrower designs, so its MA is lower. But getting that kind of performance, 16 inches, double lung on a straightforward broadside rib shot, not a huge shock expected, really.
Okay, so far so good, but you said it got surprising.
Right, that was the baseline. The expected happened. But here's where, like you said, it gets really interesting and pretty unexpected based on the study notes. The very next two shots.
Same setup.
Exactly the same setup. Same angle, same distance, same animal, hitting ribs again.
Yeah.
But the results were completely different.
Different how? Like less penetration.
Way less. But more dramatically, they didn't just penetrate less, they skidded violently off the curved surface of that buffalo's rib cage.
Violently?
Yeah, the source uses terms like distinctly observable and profoundly noticeable. So we're talking a really obvious, dramatic deflection off the bone.
Wow. Okay, so after this violent skip, how much penetration did they actually get?
Minimal. Really poor. One got just 4.25 inches, the other 5.125 inches. And crucially, neither broadhead actually penetrated through the rivet hit.
That's a massive difference from 16 inches on the first shot. Huge.
Night and day.
And I remember reading in the source, didn't one of the broadheads get damaged too?
It did. Severely damaged. One of them suffered a dramatically rolled edge. And the study makes a point of saying this is the very first time they had ever seen an Abel-Year broadhead's edge roll in any of their testing.
The first time ever on a brand new head.
On a brand new head, its very first shot, hitting a rib. It really speaks volumes about just how incredibly hard and dense those buffalo ribs are.
So if even a quality head like that, known for being tough, can roll its edge on a rib, what's the takeaway there?
Well, the study suggests something important. It suggests that maybe as a single bevel broadhead's mechanical advantage decreases, meaning as they get shorter and wider, maybe the required hardness of the steel itself needs to go up to handle those bone impacts without failing.
That makes sense. Did they know anything else about the damage?
They did note the direction of the edge roll. It was opposite to the direction the single bevel design would normally cause the arrow to rotate upon impact. Just another data point.
Okay. What about the arrow shaft itself? You mentioned those heavy IF shafts. Did they hold up?
Perfectly. The internally footed shafts came through completely undamaged. So that design seemed to be doing its job, protecting the carbon shaft even under those, pretty severe impact forces during the skip.
All right, so let's recap this bit. The lighter 125 grain Bowyer, it had performed really well in earlier tests, within reasonable shot angles. But this heavier, wider 190 grain version showed this really pronounced skipping problem, specifically on broadside rib impacts.
Yeah. And that immediately raises red flags, doesn't it? If it skips that badly off a relatively flat rib on a broadside shot, what's going to happen on more angled impacts?
Right, like hitting a shoulder blade or a leg bone or hip or even the spine,
Yeah,
especially at an angle.
exactly. Even on lighter game, not just buffalo. So the big question the study really focused on next was, why? Why did this specific head skid so badly?
Okay, so when you get a weird result like that, something unexpected, the first place you look is the basics, right? The setup.
Absolutely. Rule out the simple stuff first. Was there an issue with the arrow itself? Was it flying wonky?
Like maybe a slightly bent insert or bad fletching causing wobble, something like that.
Precisely those things. And the study documents meticulously checking all of this. They took the actual arrows used in the buffalo test, cleaned them up, inspected them thoroughly.
And check the broadhead alignment.
Yep. Checked broadhead alignment on the shafts. Found it was perfectly true. No wobble there.
Okay, so the components look good. Did they shoot them again?
They did. They fired those exact same arrows, broadheads still attached, into a standard broadhead target, 4 times each, from 20 yards.
Damn.
All 4 showed perfectly straight flight. Clean impact into the target, good penetration into the target foam. Even the arrow with the rolled broadhead edge, it still flew straight and penetrated the target just fine.
That seems pretty definitive that the arrow itself was flying true.
It's strong evidence. But they took it one step further, just to be absolutely sure. They did bare shaft testing.
Ah, okay, so remove the fletching entirely.
Exactly. They took 2 of the shafts, stripped the fletching off. Then they replaced the 190 grain obular broadheads with 190 grain field points to keep the weight and balance the same.
And how did those bare shafts fly at 20 yards?
Perfect flight. According to the study, their impact points in the target matched the fletched, broadhead-tipped arrows exactly.
Okay, so no question then.
No question. The study's conclusion here was crystal clear. The skipping problem was not caused by poor arrow flight. The issue was happening right at the point of impact. It had to be something about the broadhead's design and how it interacted with that curved bone surface.
Which brings us right back to the broadhead itself. If the arrows are flying straight, the explanation has to be in the broadhead's geometry and how it handles hitting bone at an angle.
Precisely. And this leads directly into a really fundamental question the study explored in detail. How do the actual dimensions of a broadhead, its length, its width, influence this tendency to skip off bone?
What was the main finding there?
The core finding is pretty unambiguous in the study. The tendency for a broadhead to skip, what they call the skip angle, it gets rapidly worse as the broadhead's width increases in relation to its length.
Okay, so basically, shorter and wider heads are more likely to skip off bone.
Generally speaking, yes, that's the clear trend they identified. And it makes intuitive sense when you think about it. It's directly related to the angle the blade's edge makes with the bone surface when it first makes contact.
A steeper angle makes it harder to bite in.
Exactly. A steeper angle of attack to the bone surface makes it much harder for the edge to gain purchase, to bite in and start penetrating. It's much easier for it to just glance off, to skid.
The study gives some specific measurements, doesn't it? Comparing the aboyers to some other heads known for good bone performance, like the grizzlies, that helps illustrate the point.
It really does. Let's look at those numbers, focusing on overall length, the cut width, and the angle of the main blade edge. First, the 125 grain aboyer. Remember, this one generally performed well in previous tests. It was 1.925 inches long and 1.1808 inches wide. Its main blade angle was 14.2 degrees.
Okay. And the 190 grain one that skipped?
That one was actually a bit longer, 2.361 inches, but it was significantly wider, 1.371 inches wide. Now, its main blade angle was 14.6 degrees, which is only like 0.4 degrees steeper than the 125 grain version. Almost negligible difference in the main blade angle itself.
But significantly wider relative to its length.
That's the key difference, much wider for its length. Now, contrast that with the grizzly designs they tested, which are known for penetrating bone well.
What were their dimensions?
Well, take a 190 grain grizzly they looked at. It was much longer, 3.1304 inches long, but only 1.125 inches wide. See the difference? And its main blade angle was much shallower, only 9.2 degrees.
Wow, much longer and narrower.
Exactly. And it looked at other modified grizzlies, too. One was the same length, 3.135 inches, but only 1.0 inch wide that had a main angle of just 7.4 degrees. And the Grizzly Extreme. Same length again, but super narrow, only 0.6875 inches wide. Its main angle was incredibly flat, just 4.85 degrees.
Okay, so those grizzly types are way longer compared to their width than the abayers, especially that 190 abayer.
Precisely. That long, narrow profile gives them a much higher mechanical advantage MA. And the study consistently found that these higher MA heads, the long, narrow ones like the grizzlies, showed much, much better skip angle performance. They were far less prone to skipping off bone compared to shorter, wider broadheads.
And the study mentions several other popular heads that fall into that shorter, wider category, right? Besides those.
Yes. They list examples like the Zwickey Delta, Magnus Force, the Snuffer, Muzzy Heads, G5 Montec, Ultimate Steel. Basically, many common designs fall into that lower length-to-width ratio category.
And the source actually quantified the risk for those shorter, wider heads.
They did. They noted that based on their testing, these shorter, wider heads could be expected to skid about 50% of the time, half the time, when impacting bone at just a 35-degree angle relative to the bone surface.
35 degrees. That's not even a super sharp quartering away shot, is it? Especially if you're hunting from a tree stand.
Not at all. It's a very plausible impact angle in many real-world hunting scenarios. So what this means for you, the listener, the hunter.
Yeah, what's the practical takeaway?
It means if you choose to use a broadhead that has a relatively low length-to-width ratio, one that's noticeably wider for its length, then you absolutely need to be more mindful, more careful about your shot angles.
Especially if bone might be involved.
Especially then. Those steeper angle impacts on ribs, but particularly on tougher bone like shoulders or hips, they become much riskier in terms of getting poor penetration due to skipping.
The study even includes that anecdote, that story from Curtis Keller, one of the testers. It really drives the point home. He had a skip with the 125 grain aboyer.
Right. The one that usually performed well.
On a quartering shot on a feral goat. Not even a massive animal like a buffalo.
Exactly. It wasn't a huge beast, but the angle the arrow hit the rib was steep enough that the broadhead just skipped right off the bone. It didn't penetrate the chest cavity. It just sort of zippered the skin down the goat's side.
And that happened from the ground, right? Not a tree stand shot.
Correct. Which really highlights the key point. It's not just about shooting steeply downwards from a tree stand or only relevant on giant animals. It's purely about the angle between the face of the broadhead blade and the surface of the bone it hits, wherever that happens.
So based on the aboyer's blade geometry, the study suggests that for heads like that, skipping is a real possibility at pretty much any impact angle greater than about 35 degrees relative to the bone surface.
That seems to be the implication, yes.
Yeah.
A critical piece of information for shot selection if you're using that type of head.
But what's really fascinating is that the study didn't just stop at the overall dimensions and main blade angle. They zoomed in even closer, right down to the very tip of the broadhead.
They did. He started wondering, could the specific design, the angle of the Tanto-style tip on that big 190 grain aboyer, could that be the thing that actually initiated the skid? Because its tip angle is noticeably more abrupt, steeper, than the tips on the narrower heads that previously tested for skip angle.
Interesting. So it might not just be the main blade angle driving the skip, but how the very, very point of the head interacts first.
That was the hypothesis they started exploring. And they measured and compared the attack angle of the Tanto tips on several heads. The 125 grain aboyer, its tip angle was 30 degrees. The 190 grain aboyer that skipped, its tip was steeper, 37 degrees.
Okay. How did that compare to others?
Well, the Grizzly Tanto tip, as they modified it for testing, was 30 degrees, same as 125 aboyer. But then they looked at others with intentionally steep tips. A modified Wolverine Tanto had a tip angle of 57 degrees, and a Magnus heated Tanto tip was 53 degrees.
Whoa, okay. So the 190 abayer's tip is steeper than the 125s and the Grizzlies, sure, but it's actually less steep than those Wolverine and Magnus eye tips. So did the Wolverine and Magnus skip more because of their steeper tips?
And here's the real puzzle. According to the study, no. Even though the Wolverine and Magnus eye had even steeper tip angles than the 190 aboyer, the study found they did not show greater than expected skipping tendencies for broadheads of their overall dimensions.
Huh. So that suggests it's not just the steepness of the tip angle in isolation that caused the 190 aboyer to skip so badly. Something else must be going on.
Exactly. It's more complex than just that one angle. So they looked even closer at the tip's physical shape.
What else did they measure?
They measured the actual dimensions right at the tip. Specifically, how wide the blade became right where the Tanto tip bevel ends and the main blade edge begins. And also, how far back from the very point that transition occurred. Tiny measurements.
Like how tiny?
Okay, so for the 125 grain aboyer, that transition point was 0.171 inches wide, and it was 0.152 inches back from the tip. For the 190 grain of Bowyer, it was wider, 0.205 inches, and further back, 0.185 inches from the tip.
Okay. And the others for comparison.
The Wolverine tip transition was wider still, 0.238 inches,
Yeah.
but it happened closer to the point, only 0.089 inches back. The Magnusi was 0.20 inches wide, similar to the 190 of Bowyer, and 0.145 inches back, closer to the 125 of Bowyer.
Man, those are incredibly small numbers. We're talking thousandths of an inch difference. Does that really make a difference when hitting something as hard as bone?
It seems counterintuitive, but the study strongly suggests these tiny differences might be absolutely crucial, especially for that very first critical moment of engagement with a hard bone surface.
How so?
Well, think about it. The wider tip profile on the 180 grain of Bowyer, and also the Wolverine, means the tip itself has to displace more bone material right at the start. It might have to penetrate slightly deeper before the main cutting edges behind it can fully engage the bone structure, compared to heads with narrower tips like the 125 of Bowyer or the Magnus of Threer. It also has to sort of excavate a wider initial cavity.
Okay, I can see how that might affect things. What about the bevel on the tip itself? Single versus double bevel. Did they look at that?
They did mention it. The Bowyers have single bevel tips, matching their main blades. Others, like the Magnus, have double bevel tips. They speculated that maybe a reverse bevel on the Tanto tip, like the Grizzly has, might offer a slight advantage in helping the tip grab onto bone initially.
But they weren't sure if that would help the bigger 190 Ebolier tip.
Right, they weren't certain if that potential advantage would hold true for the much larger, wider Tanto tip geometry on the 190 grain Aboyer. It was still an open question.
Okay, so if we try to summarize the study's thinking on why that specific 190 grain Ebolier skipped so badly, it sounds like it wasn't one single thing, but maybe a combination.
Exactly, that's the conjecture they landed on. It's likely a complex interaction between several factors: the relatively steep tip angle, plus the specific width and depth profile of that tip where it first contacts bone, plus the already fairly steep main blade angle relative to the bone surface. Or maybe the specific type of bevel on the tip itself is a more significant factor than previously thought.
But regardless of nailing down the exact cause, the simple fact that this particular well-regarded head skipped so dramatically under these conditions, it really highlights a gap in our understanding, doesn't it? And suggests more testing is definitely needed, maybe focusing just on tip modifications.
Absolutely. The study authors saw this as a real golden opportunity, a chance to learn specifically how these subtle, often overlooked differences in tip design, the angles, the width, the bevels, truly affect that critical initial bone penetration and the tendency to skip.
And figuring that out could potentially improve performance, not just on angled shots.
Right. Maybe understanding tip geometry better could even enhance penetration on more straightforward perpendicular bone hits, too. There's potential there.
Okay, that was a seriously deep dive into the whole bone skip phenomenon. Really fascinating stuff. But the Ashby study, this part 6, it also looks at the other side of the coin for broadhead lethality, right? Which is how efficiently it actually cuts the tissue once the tip gets through.
Exactly. We talk a lot, maybe rightly so, about penetration and mechanical advantage, especially when dealing with bone. But how well the cutting edge performs on soft tissue is just as vital for creating rapid hemorrhage and achieving quick, ethical kills.
So what's the core principle the study outlines when it comes to cutting efficiency?
The basic idea is actually pretty intuitive once you think about it.
Mm.
It's this. The longer a broadhead's cutting edge is, the greater the distance any specific piece of tissue travels along that edge as the broadhead passes through it.
Okay, makes sense. Longer edge, more travel distance. Why does that travel distance matter so much?
Because more travel distance along the edge means increased contact time between the tissue fibers and the sharp blade. And that increased contact time gives the blade more opportunity, more time, if you will, to cleanly and completely sever blood vessels and other tissues.
Ah, okay. The study used that analogy with cutting paper, didn't it?
Yes, it's a great illustration. Imagine holding a sharp knife edge against a sheet of paper. If you just push straight down, even with decent pressure, it might cut, but maybe not very cleanly, especially if the paper is thick or tough. It might even just dent it or tear it.
Right.
Now, keep the exact same downward pressure, but also push or pull the paper along the knife edge. Slicing motion, what happens?
It cuts easily, smoothly.
Right. It slices right through, much more easily and cleanly. Why? Because any given point on the paper traveled a much greater distance across the sharp edge, maximizing the cutting action.
That makes the concept of travel distance really clear.
It does. Now, apply that directly to a broadhead moving through tissue. The broadhead acts like a compound wedge. its width, its thickness, the taper of the ferrule, the angle of the edge, bevels, all these things work together to push tissues apart at an angle.
Which tensions the tissue against the edge.
Exactly. It forces the pliable tissues open and stretches them against the sharp cutting edge.
And you mentioned earlier for single bevel heads, the rotation they induce would add another layer to this.
It certainly seems plausible. That bevel-induced rotation would also tension the tissue, maybe in a slightly different way, and it might even actively drag the tissue across the blade face as the arrow spins through, which would further increase that effective travel distance along the edge, potentially boosting the cutting efficiency even more.
The study also talks about the angle of attack of the blade to the tissue itself, not just a bone, affecting the type of cut you get.
Yes. Think about a chef again. A professional using, say, a very sharp, thin Chinese cleaver. If they just bring it straight down with force chop, they can get through stuff, sure, but the study characterizes that more as a crushing cut. It relies more on force.
As opposed to
When you see them expertly slicing meat. They lay the blade down at a much lower angle to the cutting board and use a long, smooth push or pull stroke across the meat. That low angle, long stroke slices effortlessly and produces a much cleaner, smoother cut surface.
It's like cutting a tough steak at home. You don't just press straight down hard.
Exactly. We all do this intuitively, right?
Yeah.
If you have a tough piece of steak and a reasonably sharp knife, you automatically lower the angle of the knife and use a sawing or slicing motion. You increase the distance the meat travels along the edge with each stroke. Why? Because even with the same sharpness and downward pressure, slicing using that low angle and long stroke cuts through that tough steak with the least amount of effort. It maximizes the interaction between the edge and the tissue fibers.
Okay, so let's tie this all back directly to broadhead shapes again.
Well, the implication is clear. Long, narrow broadheads, the ones with high mechanical advantage, they inherently provide a better lower angle of blade attack upon the tissue as they penetrate, and they naturally facilitate longer tissue travel along their cutting edges for any given depth of penetration.
So that geometry promotes slicing.
Exactly. That geometry promotes the more efficient, cleaner, faster, and ultimately, the study argues, more lethal slicing action through tissue, rather than a more forceful tearing or crushing action.
And that efficient slicing action, it not only helps the arrow penetrate deeper because there's less resistance.
Right, less energy wasted pushing tissue aside.
But it's also critical for causing efficient hemorrhage. Cleanly sliced blood vessels bleed much more freely and rapidly than vessels that are just torn or crushed.
Precisely. Faster, more profuse bleeding leads to quicker, more humane kills.
Okay, that explanation of slicing efficiency leads perfectly into another common question, one the source actually anticipates and addresses directly. Okay, fine, but my serrated steak knives always seem to cut better than my smooth ones, especially if they're a bit dull. So why aren't serrated broadheads the best?
Yeah, it's a common point of confusion, and the study tackles it head-on. It points out several key differences between slicing your cooked steak on a dinner plate and trying to cut through living animal tissues, tough hide, and potentially bone.
What are those key differences according to the study?
Well, first, like you hinted, the comparison people often make is between a dull straight-edge knife and a serrated knife. A dull, smooth edge doesn't slice well at all. It mostly just tears or mashes the tissue. A serrated edge, even when it's dull, still tears effectively because those little points, those teeth, concentrate force and act like tiny saws.
So serrated tears well, even when dull.
It tears well. But the critical distinction the study makes is that a serrated edge, even a sharp one, simply does not cut or slice living tissue as cleanly or efficiently as a truly sharp, smooth edge does. Slicing and tearing are fundamentally different actions at the tissue level. Second big difference, that steak on your plate. It's dead, it's been processed, and it's cooked. Cooking breaks down tough connective tissues, makes everything softer. There's no tough elastic skin to get through, and certainly no bone.
Whereas hunting involves
Living tissues, which are inherently tougher, more fibrous, more elastic than cooked meat, you have incredibly resilient hide or skin to penetrate first. And then, lurking underneath, there's always the possibility of hitting bone.
Ah, yes. Bone again, the ultimate challenge for an arrow.
It really is. As the study constantly emphasizes, bone is the single most difficult tissue structure an arrow is likely to encounter. Your broadhead isn't going to neatly carve its way around a major bone. It has to have the ability to penetrate through it or split it cleanly.
And arrows don't have a lot of extra power to waste.
Exactly. The study reminds us that arrows, even from powerful bows, have very little excess kinetic energy or momentum to spare, especially when they hit something as resistant as solid bone. Every single bit of that energy needs to be applied as efficiently as possible to maximize penetration.
Okay, so with that in mind, how do serrations perform when they hit bone?
According to this study, they become a major liability, a significant disadvantage. Why? Because those tiny projections, the teeth on a serrated edge, are inherently fragile compared to a solid, smooth edge.
They break easily on bone.
They can be easily damaged, chipped, or broken off completely when they impact hard bone. And what happens once those serrations are damaged? They create massive drag. They dramatically increase the resistance the broadhead encounters as it tries to push through the bone and the tissue behind it.
So they actually reduce penetration efficiency.
Severely. Damaged serrations actively reduce the broadhead's overall mechanical efficiency precisely at the moment when you need that efficiency the most when trying to power through bone.
It's like those speed bumps you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. The study uses that physics analogy again, moving a load, like a broadhead, through tissue and bone. The most efficient way is using a smooth, gradually inclining plane. Think of a smooth wheelchair ramp. It does the most work with the least applied force because it's smooth and straight.
And serrations are like...
Serrations are like putting ridges or speed bumps all along that ramp. They just increase the resistance, increase the drag, and make it much harder to load the broadhead up the ramp and through the obstacle.
That makes perfect physical sense. Did the study offer any, real-world proof for smooth edges being better for cutting tissue?
Yeah, a simple but very effective one. Go visit your local butcher shop.
Okay.
Think about what butchers do all day long. They spend hours efficiently slicing through fresh, raw animal tissues, muscle, fat, connective tissue. What kind of knives are lining their benches?
Smooth edge knives, sharp ones.
Always. You won't find butchers using serrated knives for efficiently breaking down carcasses or making clean cuts. Why? Because they know from constant practical experience that smooth, sharp edges simply cut tissue more cleanly and efficiently than serrated edges do.
So the bottom line is serrated might tear better than a dull, smooth edge.
Correct. Better than dull. But they absolutely do not cut as well or penetrate bone as efficiently as a truly sharp, smooth edge.
What about the comparison people sometimes make to primitive flint or obsidian broadheads? Those have naturally irregular, almost serrated-like edges from knapping, don't they? And they were effective.
The study acknowledges that point. It agrees that few materials create a sharper edge right off the flake than knapped flint or obsidian. The edge can be incredibly thin, just molecules wide, which makes it very efficient at slicing. But the study points out something even more telling. Even more efficient at slicing than a knapped obsidian edge, which has microscopic irregularities, is a smoothly polished obsidian scalpel blade.
A polished edge is even better. Why?
Because polishing removes even those microscopic serrations left from knapping. It creates an edge that is absolutely perfectly smoothed down to the finest level. The study even notes that back in the days before laser eye surgery became common, surgeons sometimes use these incredibly sharp, smoothly polished obsidian scalpels for the most delicate eye procedures. Why? Because that perfectly smooth edge made an incision as fine, clean, and flawless as a surgical laser could. Minimal tissue damage.
Wow. Okay. So the absolute pinnacle of cutting efficiency, at least when hard bone isn't the primary obstacle you're trying to overcome, comes from a perfectly smooth, perfectly sharp edge.
That's certainly the conclusion you draw from the study's analysis of cutting edges. While a knapped edge is effective largely because it's incredibly thin, achieving a truly smooth edge seems to represent the highest level of pure cutting efficiency described in this research.
Man, this has been, well, a really deep dive into just this one section, part 6 of the Ashby study. It just lays bare how much incredible complexity there is in broadhead design. It goes way beyond just, how many blades it has or what the cut diameter is.
It really, really does. It shows conclusively that these factors we might not always think about first, like the broadhead's overall length compared to its width, or the specific angles and tiny dimensions right at the very tip where it first hits bone, and even the fundamental nature of the cutting edge itself, whether it's smooth or serrated. All of these things play absolutely critical roles in how that broadhead is going to perform, especially when it runs into resistance, like hitting bone or going through really tough tissue.
And understanding these specific details, getting into this level of the why, it really helps explain why certain broadhead designs tend to perform differently from others out there in the real world. Particularly, when conditions aren't perfect, when the shot angle isn't ideal.
Exactly. It gives you a much more solid scientific basis for appreciating what makes a particular broadhead design robust and reliable, or may be potentially problematic in certain situations you might encounter while hunting.
Absolutely. Hopefully digging into this gives you, the listener, some really specific things to think about, maybe when you're looking at the broadheads you have in your quiver right now, or when you're considering different designs, or even just thinking about how you approach your shot selection and judging angles the next time you're out in the field.
Yeah, it definitely adds another deeper layer to understanding this absolutely critical piece of your hunting equipment.
For sure. And here's maybe a final thought, something to really mull over based on everything we've just discussed from this study. If even tiny, almost imperceptible differences, we're talking thousandths of an inch in the dimensions and the bevels right at the very tip of a broadhead. If those tiny details, as highlighted in this research, can potentially be the difference between smooth penetration and having a high-quality, high-performance head skip violently off something as common as an animal's rib,
Hmm.
what does that tell us about the incredible level of precision that might actually be required in both manufacturing and selecting our broadheads? And maybe, just maybe, how much potential performance is still waiting to be unlocked by truly optimizing these subtle, often completely overlooked design details at the very front end of our arrows?
It certainly puts a huge spotlight on those details, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Something to think about.
definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.